Hello everybody, Jacksistential here with another video. Today I thought we'd talk about what Lutherans started in their early days of the Reformation in Christendom in the 16th century. Now, to recap the story of Martin Luther, he was a German monk who after a pilgrimage from Rome, he came back to his native state in the Holy Roman Empire, where he wrote his 95 Theses in protest against the Catholic Church, especially the papal selling of indulgences to raise money and guarantee people a seat in heaven. Now, this placed Luther under a public arrest warrant by the Council of Worms, or Worms, I should say. No, the Diet of Worms. And Luther was promptly abducted by Frederick the Wise of Wittenberg, and Frederick used Luther as a essentially political tool to rally anti-papal sentiment in the German states, and thereby translating the New Testament and eventually the Old Testament into German. This was big for the time. Before then, Christendom was bound to the Latin language, the Latin Vulgate, as the early Christian Jerome translated it from the Greek and the Hebrew. So, what happened after Martin Luther? Now, it gets a little fuzzy. It gets a little violent. Now, okay, so Lutheranism spread quickly in Germany following Martin Luther's debate with the Roman Catholic Church over indulgences in 1757, because the core of Luther's theology, a liberating sense of God's forgiveness and grace, struck a chord with many of Luther's contemporaries. Following Luther's death in 1546, Lutheranism underwent three important developments. The first, in the 16th and 17th centuries, goes by the name of Protestant scholasticism, or Protestant orthodoxy, or Lutheran orthodoxy, as some might say. The second, in the 18th and 19th century, resulted from the influence of rationalism. Finally, also in the 18th and 19th centuries, the development of Pietism influenced Lutheranism. Pietism just meaning a sort of general faith to a universal God, a general faithfulness or just a kind of faithful character or a faithful habit towards prayer, blessings, and that sort of stuff, which was sort of spreading amongst Eastern mystics and Eastern theologians, and spreading around Europe and the West. So after Luther's death in 1546, his colleague Philip Melanchthon, yes, 1497 to 1560, adjudicated a series of disputes about the proper interpretation of Luther's theology. The result of these disputes as a whole was a shift in the tenor of Lutheranism from an experience of grace to an emphasis on correct doctrine. So, for example, John Agricola, from circa 1494 to 1566, argued that Luther's understanding of the gospel meant doing away with the law as a means to salvation. This was not only sort of thrown around at the time of the Reformation, but also it was a belief amongst some early Christians that Christ got rid of the law, and some interpret Paul the apostle as dismissing Christians from the Jewish law. Now, Jesus, on one hand, says that I have not come to abolish the law but fulfill it. So does that mean, at least according to Christians, that the law and the covenant doesn't apply to Gentiles? Well, Jews don't believe it applies to Gentiles, but Jesus was a Jew, so therefore we don't even need to include the old canon in the Christian canon, the Old Testament. We don't need that. Now, we're going to see now that this is going to have some pretty major pushback. Now, for example, Agricola took this to an extreme that is called antinomianism, or meaning against the law, contending that one had no obligation to fulfill the law, and even that good works were determinal to salvation. That's also sort of interpreted in Paul's epistles. Is it faith? Is it works? Well, Paul kind of says both are important, or at least according to the letters that are in Paul's name, and some of them in Paul's name could be seen as him encouraging good works, because just faith alone is not enough. This regards Luther's view that while good works do not earn salvation, the justified Christian filled with the Spirit will perform works of love for his or her neighbor. In opposition, George Major insisted that while God alone justified humans, good works were necessary for salvation. And this too clearly contradicts Luther's interpretation or general rule about a Christian interpreting the New Testament. Because keep in mind, now that the Bible was translated into German and was beginning to get translated eventually into French and Old Dutch, lots and lots of ideas were suddenly like, oh, wait a second. Well, this says we're freed from the law, but we're going to still need to prove ourselves, our faith to Christ, through good works. But Luther says that we don't need works to prove our faith in Christ, because we already have faith in Christ, and that is enough. Now, Melanchthon acted as a mediator in the controversy, suggesting that while one could not say that good works were necessary for salvation, one could say that good works were necessary. While this does not distort Luther's position, neither is it in the same spirit. For Luther, doctrine was never considered independently of genuine relation to faith. Now, similar disputes arose over proper relationship to the church, of the church to civil government, free will, and the way in which Christ was present in the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. One party, which called itself the Gnesiolutherans, or genuine Lutherans, accused Melanchthon of being a, quote, crypto-Calvinist. Now, Calvin was, at the time, a sort of rival theologian of the Reformation, against, at least in the Lutheran space of the Reformation. John Calvin was French and had some pretty unforgiving ideas of salvation. Now, Philip Melanchthon's supporters were dubbed Philippists. Melanchthon was less concerned to draw sharp theological lines than some of his Lutheran colleagues. He proposed language for the Augsburg Confession that said that in the Lord's Supper the body and blood of Christ were truly exhibited, quote unquote. The original creed said truly present, not exhibited. So the words spoken at the moment of consecration, quote, as Jesus says, "This is my body," meant to Melanchthon that the body and blood of Christ were received in the elements, not necessarily that the bread and wine were the body and blood. This flexibility in doctrine allowed Melanchthon to reach common ground with Calvin on the Lord's Supper. So these doctrinal debates seem to fall back into a kind of logical hair-splitting that Protestants associate with medieval Catholic theology, and they contributed to warfare between various sects. And this was followed by a movement called rationalism. So rationalism was a part of an 18th century European period called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was an opinion that the Enlightenment had a higher opinion of human reason and goodness than Luther and the other reformers. So it was a period when new methods of determining truth, or the scientific method, for example, as well as modern historical approach to ancient documents, such as the Bible, began to challenge traditional methods. It was the period where people began experimenting with self-government of the people. For example, the North American continent, the French Revolution. Luther and his colleagues were not against the use of reason itself, only against the use of reason apart from faith in God. Rationalists focused on what all humans, apart from specific revelation or confession, could know was true. They argued that all religions shared the same core ideas, one of which that the key part of religion is moral behavior. The special revelations claimed by God, by some groups, or Luther's claim to the gospel promises, for example, were seen as true insofar as they agreed with these core ideas, but less important than the core idea, and dangerous insofar as they separated people into confessional camps. Note, while rationalists disagreed with the Philippists and Gnesiolutherans on almost everything, they agreed, all of them, that religion was primarily a matter of determining and following correct beliefs. So, in other words, you got to find a sort of orthodoxy to this reformation, because you're reforming the church. You're technically not abolishing the church, because a church is still a church. It's an institution. It's a way of life with rules, and Jesus gave that institution to his disciples, or at least he told his disciples to form one. So in response to both Protestant scholasticism and rationalism, a very influential movement in Germany developed in the 18th and 19th centuries called Pietism. Yes, okay, so it started in Europe and moved into the East. Eastern nobility did adopt Pietism. It's just this general belief that a sort of moral character in harmony with being religious is the most important virtue. Now, its originators are Philip Spener and August Franke from 1663 to 1727. These men developed small cells called Collegia Pietatis, or associations of piety. These were not separate from the Lutheran Church, and both men required their followers to remain within the Lutheran Church. They were small groups that met for Bible study and prayer. The point was not merely increased understanding, but the practical effects of Bible study on believers' lives. Their intention was to act as a leaven for the church, to infuse it with spiritual life. One pietist, Count Zinzendorf, offered his estate in Moravia as a place of refuge to a persecuted sect from Bohemia that had been founded by the proto-reformer Jan Hus from 1372 to 1415, and they still exist in the region of the Czech Republic. A century before Luther, Hus had embraced some of what were to become key doctrines of the Protestant movement. These disciples of Hus had immigrated to Germany, where they were given safe haven by Zinzendorf. This is the origin of the Moravian Church. The pietists soon took control of the faculty of the University of Halle, which became a major training ground for pietists, ministers, and theologians. Okay, so that is sort of the world of development after Luther in the Protestant church, because they're protesting the Catholic Church, the Universalists. Okay, once you decide to protest the Universal Church, what does that leave you with? Okay, it leaves you still with a church, but you claim to be protesting against it or reforming it. Now, Catholics call protesters, the protesters call themselves reformers. Now, they had to get these ideas straight, and moreover, they had to be able to phrase it in a clear, understandable way to continental Europeans who had these traditions of Catholicism and these beliefs in saints, and paying alms to certain saints, or asking for intercession from saints instead of direct prayer to Christ. This is a problem back then, and it's still heavily debated between Protestants and Catholics to this day. That's about all we will talk about today, so comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.